Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is S.C. Coleman, author. So in this video, we'll be talking about the concept of being spread thin and as it applies to globalism, or this concept of global control. The first thing we've heard in many details, in many ways, usually in certain contexts, is this term redistribution of wealth. Now, most people think about redistribution of wealth, or at least they're taught that it represents the Robin Hood idea, which, by the way, Robin Hood is robbing in a hood, thus rob in hood. Well, the idea is that you take from the rich and give to the poor. Of course, with the whole system, whenever somebody says something like redistribution of wealth as though it's a good thing or a bad thing, usually they're taking that standpoint, taking money from the rich, giving to the poor. They don't generally, on either side of it, whether redistribution of wealth is good or redistribution of wealth is bad, talk about the actual nature of it. Neither do they talk about how it came to be that there are rich and poor. Often with these things, there's emotional entanglement involved, and people want to believe certain things. They don't want to talk about practicality, actuality, or even the abject explanation and analysis of why there are rich and poor people. Rich being, of course, the idea of having certain types of wealth, either usually a lot of money, but generally the idea of being rich actually has to do with appearance. The appearance being rich, the appearance of being able to purchase many things which have a high cost. None of that takes into account the analysis of the economy, the actual valuation of things, utilitarian value of things, nor does it take into account the changes in the political climate and atmosphere, and it doesn't take into account economic manipulation. So this redistribution of wealth in actuality has something very important to do with economic manipulation. It is the redistribution of country wealth, or wealth from land, to other countries, so that a system of monetary global control can be imposed. That is what redistribution of wealth is. It has nothing to do with taking from the rich and giving to the poor. It entirely has to do with leveraging a control system based off monetary concepts. In the schools, this is called Keynesian or Keynesian, I say Keynesian economics. Now they say that there's a person named Keynes, but the operative word here is actually key. The Keynesian economic system. That is how you say that word, Keynesian. Not Keynesian, Keynesian. Because it is the keys, that is the conceptualization of developing keys. The keys to the globe, essentially. Or, to quote the title of certain series of books, the keys to the kingdom. The primary tenet of Keynesian economics is to induce scarcity. This is not just about inducing scarcity, however, it's inducing control over the resources which are scarce. If you induce scarcity but somebody else controls that scarcity, then you're not really inducing it. well, you could induce it, but then somebody takes control, say raids your stockpile or warehouses, etc., and you lose control of the scarcity, and then those people deem that they would prefer to have scarcity so they can retain control instead of you. So there is that possibility. Either way, this idea of inducing scarcity means rampant and unnecessary destruction of resources for the purpose of narrowing it down to a finite amount. And then these, in the broad scheme of Keynesian economics, are then leveraged through regulatory structures which dictate which resources certain countries can produce, hence the global domestic product system, or GDP. The idea is that each country produces certain items and it's dictated to them, right? Each land country, based off of the land. They create these arbitrary land borders and then say, within these borders, you're only allowed to produce such and such amount or types of objects or products or things. And then they're shipped somewhere else. And that is a primary control mechanism. Now this comes down to the idea of communist versus capitalist. There is no such thing. They capitalize control over communes or communities of human capital. The communist states are designed to produce free, relatively, or cheap labor of large human capital under tight regulatory control, so that all of those products and things produced there can then be leveraged into the export-import centers, which gives them the ability to leverage a global monetary and economic control structure, with the idea of capitalism and communism both being equal parts of the same function. North and South Korea were the test phase. Goods and services produced in North Korea, cheaply and in many cases freely, free of charge essentially to the people controlling the area, the regulators, etc., can then be brought into South Korea and then leveraged across the planet for control. Because South Korea becomes the primary importer-export system with which they can hide behind various laundering firms and companies and company names and things like that. Because it's not coming from North Korea, it's coming from South Korea. They just put the made in South Korea stamp on it, even though it might have been brought in from North Korea, or those resources used to make that product might have been brought in from North Korea. And the biggest example of this right now, of course, is China. China is the perfect example of this communist paradise in which everybody there, the population there, is seen as a human capital resource which can be leveraged to control other countries and flush the economy, or otherwise dump on the economy, with cheap Chinese-made objects. This is not an old idea. It's this is not a new idea, I mean to say. It's a very old idea. It's been going on a long while. But because of the brainwashing structure that we have today, very few people are probably, anyway, I don't want to definitively say very few people, but I would suspect that very few people are actually aware of this. Today, however, the globalists are spread thin. The controllers, foreign controllers, so here in the city of Columbus in the state of Ohio in the United States, a large portion or a large number of foreigners are being imported, but these aren't just like the idea of, low skilled labor, working class type foreigners that they constantly talk about and deride mock people every time they talk about the immigration system. You're either, for or against it, but you can't. They won't recognize the fact that their so-called immigration system is an illegitimate extortion racket based off of fraudulent foreign control. And it's a corporation system. So the globalists being spread thin, they have to import controllers from other countries. These are big shot bigwigs, right? Spies. A lot of them are subcontracted through nonprofits and whatnot, and they're relatively ignorant of what they're doing. They only have one purpose. That's to maintain the flow of extraction. They must maintain the flow of extraction, and now we're going to get into why. First, a historical example with Japan. The emperor was under control of the militia, or military, in the period of 1930 to 1940. It is the same with the Pasha in Tunisia, as listed out in Levantine Adventure, the Travels and Adventures of the Chevalier d'Arvaux, 1690, I don't remember the dates on it, but it's a book by Warren Lewis, in which the Divan was a council made up of the heads of the militia, meaning the entire military, or as we would say, the U.S. Armed Forces. The militia in that context was the Navy, the Army, and the Town Guard, or City Guard, as far as Tunisia is concerned. It's a little bit different from our U.S. Constitution militia, which creates it separately from the Army and the Navy. The U.S. Constitution concept of the militia is different than most because militia is generally used as a broad term to cover all the different forces. The Dey was the head of the Divan, and they controlled Tunisia, and this is the same structure that controlled most of the North African republics. The Pasha was kept there so that there was a nominal representation with the Ottoman Empire. But if the Pasha stepped out of line, they would kill him, and the Ottoman Empire would send another Pasha. But he wasn't allowed to do anything. He was escorted everywhere. As the saying goes, when you have guards that are protecting you, they look outwards. When you have guards that are keeping you, they look toward you. And that's the same situation with the Emperor of Japan in the 30s to 40s, the period before and during, of course, World War II, as far as we're taught anyway, is that the military aspect of that country held the emperor under their control, looking inward instead of outward. So he wasn't allowed to do anything, had no power. Japan's attack on China delayed the globalist plans that we would eventually see with Mao Zedong. This is the reason why U.S. forces attacked Japan, and it was entirely because Japan attacked and occupied China. And it's because the global control structure of banksters and or the banking mafia, as many people call them, and the academics and all the other little traders that we've had for a long time, the clergy, they wanted China for what they're using it for now, and Japan stopped them, or I guess delayed them for a certain period of time. So when Japan was attacked by U.S. forces under false pretenses, they had to free up their occupation of China, and thus the control of Mao was established later through planned armament. And this was by way of Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek was their alleged ally. So what they did was they sent to Chiang Kai-shek, top secret, whatever, I don't know if they had the actual classification of top secret back then, but they sent schematics, important confidential schematics, and a crap ton of firearms and weapons to Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek had all the equipment, everything that was necessary to win, and then he fled to Taiwan. All of that stuff got in the hands of the communists, and it solidified their control over China. This was planned. Also, when you listen to the tapes talking about our enemy Japan, you look at it and say, I don't see anything, I don't see much wrong with the way it is, but the fact is that they have a tone of contempt in those videos for the military in general. The concept of military, the concept of bravery and courage. They have hatred for it. And so they're sending U.S. warriors to go fight in Japan when they hate military in general, including the U.S. military, because in order to be part of the military, you have to have courage and valor and strength and all that stuff. And there's a tone of hatred for military in general in those propaganda videos. It's not specific to Japan, because when they say Japan is militaristic, they say Japan is militaristic as in the military is a obsolete concept, and that anyone who joins the military is basically a caveman. Sure, they say it in Japan, but they say something like Japan is a backwards country because they emphasize so much military valor, and that those are not ideals of a modern society. That's how they say it. Very eye-opening. So obviously they don't give a rat's ass about what happens to U.S. soldiers. We're all just basically cannon fodder, meat shields, and same goes for all the fake law enforcement people, cops, sheriffs, state highway patrol, all these people, right? They're meat shields. These people don't care about them. They'll take anybody off the street, put them in uniform, send them out there to die. Because the concept of military valor and courage is outdated, as they would say. It's what you hear in their video. You hear it from their mouths, and you see it in their writing. It proliferates everything. They hate courage, they hate valor, and they hate the military. All militaries. So when we come to Afghanistan, we can take the example of Japan and match it almost perfectly to Afghanistan. All these patterns line up. In Afghanistan, the Taliban were Pakistani students making a false image of Afghani tribal rule. So basically, in Afghanistan, the academics, the universities would bring in Pakistani students, and then they would all go around and they get filmed going into schools and smashing up computers and stuff like that, and they'd say, this is the Taliban, and the Taliban are the Afghanis, essentially. And other people who can't tell the difference between a Pakistani and a Taliban, or a Pakistani and an Afghani, they wouldn't know the difference. They'd say, oh yeah, okay, I agree with that, right? So Afghani tribesmen, this is the reason why this happened. This is the reason why the Pakistani students were falsely representing the Afghani tribesmen, is because the Afghani tribesmen burned the CIA heroin fields, denied entry to the United Nations, and they also originally supported the U.S. invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. Also, it's important to note that the U.S. apparently accidentally bombarded 2 Red Cross facilities in Afghanistan. I don't think there was any accident to that, and I expect absolutely those Red Cross outfits were in fact being used as a cover for Taliban activities, being that the Taliban were Pakistani students. And military intelligence operatives, being as effective as they are, probably found that out, bombed those facilities. But they can't have that published, so they have to say it was accidental. The next thing is that Pakistani students are currently in London, and there is currently a war between the Afghanis and Pakistan. And what's interesting is that the situation between Afghanistan and Pakistan lines up almost exactly with the situation of Japan and China. Afghanistan wipes out the United Nations control. They destroy the CIA's ability to leverage their Keynesian drug economics, scarcity of control, and then selling heroin and transporting it and everything like that. And they absolutely ruin the globalist plans in the region. Thus, the globalists foment false pretense, September 11th attacks on 9/11, in order to restore control over that area and free up their other resources. Just like Japan invades and takes over China to stop them becoming a communist state, quote unquote, and thus suicide bombers, again, attack Pearl Harbor, which they publish as sporadically, panically, and everywhere, so that then they can go and attack Japan to free up their resources in China. What a carbon copy exact. That is the playbook. You do something, they lie, they get people ignorantly to go and attack, and thus they get what they want. It's very simple. And it has happened many times, and it's probably going to happen again. But it's hard to say, because it does seem that less and less people today are falling for that rather ridiculous tactic. But it's still hard for people to accept that. There's a lot of people, I think, that accept the fact that the September 11th attacks were a quote-unquote inside job. It's a lot more difficult, I think, for many people who actually care, that is, that Pearl Harbor was an inside job. It's most people today, probably the younger generations, don't care about Pearl Harbor because they're trained not to care about history or the past in the school system because it's boring. And the other people are so set in their ways, the older generations, that they couldn't possibly recognize that Pearl Harbor was an inside job. Then again, anybody who could recognize that September 11th attacks were an inside job probably wouldn't have as much trouble recognizing Pearl Harbor as the same exact thing. The story matches up perfectly. You have kamikaze pilots suicide bombing themselves into ships in a naval yard in Pearl Harbor. You have kamikaze suicide bomber Muslims suicide bombing themselves into towers in New York City on planes. It's so obvious, I think. It's just crazy. So one of these things that we need to think about, though, with the monetary shifts and the understanding why so many people around the globe hate the United States for what the United Nations and the globalists have been doing, is because they use bills printed with U.S. government on the face. So you have CIA operatives, which are subcontracted mostly, shipping billions of dollars in US dollar bills to countries in order to destabilize them, cause chaos, pay a whole bunch of robbers and thieves and thugs and foreign mercenaries to go in and pillage and destroy. Of course, everybody's going to hate the United States because that's who they see on the money going to those criminals and traitors. Of course, the majority of people in the United States are not supportive of that. And it's in fact the opposite. And the reason why we need to have so many constant moronic distractions, because if people had time to cogitate and to think about, to contemplate what's been going on with so-called FACO US aid and everything, well, people would be out there with guns marching on these little imbeciles in the FACO municipal governments and the state governments and all them, because they're all involved, right? And people would be actually organizing to hunt down the CIA operatives, right? The so-called CIA operatives, these subcontracted little low-life criminals types of people who did all this stuff, right? Because it was all done in secret, and it was done, and we, of course, in the propaganda are constantly blamed, meaning we the people, for what they were doing in our name. And they do this thing all the time, all over the place. People would be obviously taking over and occupying the universities, because universities are a major portion of this, and all the churches, of course. These facilities are, any nonprofit facility, any religious nonprofit facility, is a money laundering institution. Perfect for that. They built the system to be able to do that. So they can hide, do bad stuff, and then blame someone else. That's what they always do. They always lie and blame and steal, and they're just It's the thought process. And it's replicated throughout all their organizations. Everybody else thinks like that. They all think about lying and cheating and stealing. There's no courage. There's no... I mean, you look at the cops and police and all the so-called law enforcement people, right? As soon as there's something that happens, they all want to go undercover. They all want to start hiding in their vehicles and start tracking people and reading license plates and doing all this other stuff. I mean, they're really blatant about it. It's very easy to spot them. But that's what they think. They think like criminals. They are criminals. All of them. They're thieves and robbers and liars, right? They're highwaymen. The highway patrol people and all the people who charge you for traffic stops or speeding, they're stealing from you, right? They're thieves. So they'll think like that. Of course, it's ironic because they think that they're these special commando undercover espionage agents when in their day job, if you will, they ride around in marked vehicles with flashing lights and sirens. So it's kind of 1 foot in the door, 1 foot out the other, right? They think they can be these like super clandestine espionage agents and at the same time think like somebody who wants to be seen and known and have a imposing presence. It doesn't work. When they go into their clandestine service, they always go around with the same sort of bully demeanor, in your face up front. That's not how clandestine service works. Clandestine service, generally speaking, is the gray man, the person who blends in the background. On the other hand, there's a lot of clandestine operations which are psychological in nature and do in fact require some type of more intimidating approach to get the job done. So when we look at the monetary elements here, it's important to note, like I said, with those bills of those dollar bills, is how we got to this point today. The first is that bills of tender, which is printed on the US dollar notes, is given in exchange for change, right? So if you go to a supermarket, you will buy something for 25 cents. And then you give that person $1 and they give you 75 cents back, which we call change. Change is simply the elimination of the E and X in exchange. You are tendering that bill for change, which is an exchange for coins. Those coins, the color of those coins, is indicative of metal. There's a reason why our coins are either colored with that silver color, right? Even the word silver. Silver is the color. There's the color of silver. It is a strong color. Dimes, nickels, quarters, they're all silver colored, but they're not silver anymore. And that's because originally these bills of tender were intended to be exchanged for silver coins. The silver coins were then reduced down in an act of fraud, which is considered an act of war, which is the devaluation of money and currency. And you could describe this as fool's silver. There's a reason we don't have gold-looking coins, because people did not exchange. They did not use gold as a currency, as a supermarket or penny market, often is what they might be called, exchange. They did not use gold as exchange. Gold was used in a larger capacity for bigger purchases and things like that. It was silver. If we used gold, then we would have gold-colored coins, which would be nothing more than tokens, and you could call them fool's gold. We do, in fact, have a substance called fool's gold. When people went out prospecting for gold, they would often think they struck gold, but really they struck pyrite, called fool's gold. So right now what we do is we pay in fool's silver. They are coins with no silver content, and our bills of tender are personal company, private company checks. When you work for a corporation, you get a checkbook of company checks. They have the denominations or note amounts written on them already, and they're signed usually by the chief executive officer and the finance officer, or they are signed by the chief executive officer and the bank that is backing the notes, or the officer of the bank backing the notes, or some other third party, etc. Right? It all depends on how it's set up. And then you go around with those corporate notes and you pay for things usually between companies and corporations and organizations such as car rental companies, airlines, hotels, which are all involved in some type of agreement or program with that corporation. That is what our U.S. Federal Reserve notes are. They are private corporate checks and nothing more. Thank you.